All right, welcome to the first Cluster API Data Model Workstream kickoff meeting. I will start sharing my screen for the agenda. So the goal of this meeting is to talk about Cluster API data types. So high level, what the boundaries are, the requirements, and linking their use cases. For folks that are not familiar with the current structure for Cluster API is split into two different high-level types. So we have machine and cluster, and we have two controllers for the machines, machine sets, and machine deployments. And we also offer machine classes. This approach has been kind of discussed over the course of the past months. It has some pros and cons. At this point, we would like to discuss from a high level what we want to offer in Cluster API going forward. There was a proposal that myself and Robert Bailey from Google wrote a while ago to address some of these issues, which was going to introduce new types, but we put that on hold. And I would like to start the conversation here. I put down the types that we kind of think we identify as high level, but we can always add new ones and try to kind of keep the conversation without going too much into implementation details. Given that these meetings are there's a large group right now here, and there's a second one on Thursday. Let's try to keep most of the interaction asynchronous after the meeting, so that we can give folks in EMEA or APAC a chance to chime in either on Discuss or a Google Doc. Does that sound good? Perfect. So at a high level, as I mentioned, currently we have cluster and machine, and we also have machine set, machine deployments as controllers of machine. And then kind of separately, we have machine classes, which can be thought of as a template for machines. We have been talking about two other types that we would like to add, and these are also covered in the requirements that you can see in the PR 882, which is still open, which kind of tries to add the requirements for the entire project. For the new types, control plane is something that will probably be described within this group, but the details will probably go into the other work stream that I believe Hodrick is kind of facilitating. And then we have the infrastructure type, which at this point, some cluster API providers kind of try to describe the infrastructure within the cluster. So the goal of this meeting is also to discuss what do we see the infrastructure type doing in Cluster API, how does this link to the other types, and how do we expose information. One other thought that came out of the other proposal was the cluster as being an umbrella. So right now the cluster object or type is considered optional in some providers, and some providers instead use labels to identify the cluster of machines and what the cluster controller should do. We're thinking about having the cluster object as kind of like an umbrella, so that it would kind of span and be linked to all the other types, but more specifically, the cluster should also offer some, from a UX point of view, offer a high-level type where you could create your cluster, where you can describe your cluster, and you can have one type kind of to own many, if that makes sense. And we can achieve that with remote references or owner references on the types, and but that's more implementation. But just to give an idea.
Can I ask a question, Vince?
Yes.
What are these are just suggested types, or have these been like officially? Are these like the official types we want?
No. The goal of this this meeting is so we have this idea of adding new types and defining this high-level types. So I'm trying to present where like I'm coming from and what we discussed in the other proposal, and kind of leave the room open to more thoughts and questions.
Gotcha. Cool. How did you come up? Like, what was the thought process behind getting to these two types, control plane and infrastructure?
So the control plane is kind of easier. So like right now, there's a lot of repetition for setting up a control plane. For example, in the AWS provider, we have a label that defines this if a machine is a node or a control plane. And we cannot offer at this point like high-level mechanism, for example, for control plane upgrades or like generic control plane management. And this is also expressed very well in the requirements, which it's like they define some boundaries on like what cluster API should be able to do. And so having a control plane as like a high-level object, it will not only allow cluster API to offer kind of more out-of-the-box features for control plane management, but in the future, for example, when like we will have to support like SDADM, we can further like kind of take a step like in that direction to kind of like use also these other tools. And the other thing that was mentioned was external control planes. So if you have a control plane that like it's not managed by Cluster API, but you want to use Cluster API to manage nodes across cloud providers, and you just want to join those nodes to the control plane. The control plane type can offer, for example, like a kubeconfig. Just to give an example, don't take my word to it. To kind of like say this is a control plane, it's externally managed, and we like Cluster API won't do anything other than kind of use those credentials or like whatever credential mechanism we want to use to access the control plane and join nodes to control plane.
One thing that would help me with this proposal would be defining like what use cases. I guess I'm familiar with the use case document, like what use cases this would solve, and like what the existing implementation like sort of fails to achieve in like the direction we want to head.
So the proposal is not like shouldn't be used as a like. It should be used for ideas, but it's not the proposal that it's going to go for the CAP. We should start from scratch. I updated the note saying this is an outdated proposal. This is where a lot of ideas came in, but we shouldn't use the proposal that we wrote as like a starting point for this discussion. I'm curious to hear if like others have any other opinions, especially like around the cluster being like an umbrella, and also offering like a top kind of like we call it top-down approach. But imagine the user experience being something like, hey, I want a cluster. This is my cluster. This is my unique YAML, for example, and I can describe everything in here. The goal is to just define kind of like this higher level types and the boundaries where they can span.
Vincent, I have it's not related exactly to what you said. It's more continuing with the previous comment regarding the use cases, because the requirement was translated into a document in the repository proposal, but the use cases so far, I think it haven't. I mean, there was still like an external document, and in one of the meetings we discussed the idea. I think it was kind of, I won't say agreement, but more or less a common idea that we should like try to keep a reference from the use cases just to keep the conversation in place. I mean, my question is, should we at some point uh, review this use case? Because at this point, there are many use cases where are still labeled like out of scope, and others that seem like they are not like finished. But the thing that, are we going to I would say clean up this and have a kind of official list of reference use cases just for the sake of saying these requirements is because of use case A or B? I think that will be very helpful. Not right now, but my question is because once we get into the details, it will be very useful. So I don't know what the state of this use case document is.
Yeah, so if you mentioning the use case document that we filled in, so we discussed that last week that we will PR that use case document inside the repo, and then as workstream make progress on KEPs or cluster API enhancement proposals, we'll take out the use cases that make sense for that KEP and put them, like pretty much move them over, if that makes sense. I hope that answered the question.
I think use cases are going to span multiple caps. I don't know if moving them over makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I'll link the use case docs in chat.
When you say that you're going to pull them into a repo, which repo?
Yes, so in the cluster API repo.
Okay.
So I'm going to link to the, where is it, 8082. So this PR, it's probably going to get merged at some point this week, unless there are any more updates to be done. But it adds into the docs/proposal the kind of like the template. There's a template there, but also it will add the scope and objective for this project. The idea is to have also docs/use cases which is like what we come up with in the document. So it would pretty much probably be just a copy of the document inside like in Markdown. And the idea is so that at some point later, as we write KEPs, we take the use case that makes sense for the KEP and kind of link them all together with requirements and goals and non-goals as well.
Thank you.
So Vince, getting back to the question you posed a few minutes ago, I mean, I think that the high-level types, I think the idea of a control plane for high-level types, that makes sense to me. I think that one of the things I want to emphasize, I think we should be careful around, is making sure that these are composable, or that is that there's not interdependencies between them where you have to have a cluster in order to have a machine, for example. I think that falls in line with what Tim was talking about last week on Friday about the sort of different components that can be built on top of one another. And so I think, if I recall correctly, that today they tend to be a little bit more intertwined than I think would be ideal.
Yes and no. So today, actually, the cluster object is optional. The problem is that it is creating fragmentation across providers. So, for example, one provider will define clustering machines, and the problem that we have seen a lot is that the cluster, at this point in time, it's kind of like an overloaded type, given that it also manages infrastructure and it also manages network resources, for example, in AWS, right? Or load balancers. So the proposal here, that's why like come up with like, oh, we should have an infrastructure like type, which is completely different and it has like a completely different purpose, but within the scope of creating a Kubernetes cluster.
Right. I guess okay. how opinionated do we want? There's the cluster API, which defines these basic resources, and there's controllers that manage those, and things like machine controller, that's going to be provider specific. I think already today machine deployment is not, which is great. It's built on top of other APIs, and so with cluster, if we say we break it into this infrastructure, control plane, or different pieces, what are the APIs between those things, and which controllers can be swapped out, and how do we keep it clean like it was done, I think, with machine and machine deployment, you don't want to bake in too many opinions to the specification, because the individual provider of, say, a cluster controller is going to want to put their opinions in that kind of deployment. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question, and it's also one of the goals that we want to provide. Like, for example, some isolation between the types. But I think the answer to your question is that the extension mechanism workstream will actually achieve the extensibility you're looking for.
Okay.
But from a type perspective, you mentioned that you don't see you kind of you want to use these types as composable, but they should not be interlinked. And I do agree. One thing though that it was confusing, for example, when I came into the project, was what is the relationship between a cluster and machines? Why are machines not in a cluster if we're creating Kubernetes clusters? Why is even infrastructure part of the cluster, right? And so that's why, I was mentioning, especially from a user experience perspective, and just also general management perspective, having the cluster, which would be the cluster object, we kind of see it as being combination of namespace and a name, and that combination has to be unique in the namespace, of course. But if that cluster owns and links to all the other resources, so it's like an umbrella, then it's very clear that these machines are part of this cluster, this control plane is part of this cluster, and then from a user perspective, I might be able to, for example, have one single spec where I could, and I'm just brainstorming here, where I could, for example, describe my cluster that I want, submit it to Cluster API, and Cluster API would create those links for me.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. When I say composable, I sort of mean layered, right? So that cluster, that umbrella is layered on top of all the other ones, but the other ones don't depend on the cluster existing. It's how the references are oriented, which direction they go in, the dependency.
Just a question here. Do other resources like machines and so on and so forth make sense without having a cluster? And if yes, then under what circumstances? What would be the use cases where you would have a machine, but you wouldn't have a cluster? I understand that you probably need to create some sort of flexibility and abstraction to allow the specific providers to provide their own, but would it even under what circumstances the machines or machine sets would exist if we don't have the cluster?
I think the scenario I'm thinking of is that as a provider of a distribution, that I may decide that the way that the open source community has defined cluster doesn't fit with the way I want to deploy Kubernetes. And so I would still like to be able to use the other valuable things like the machines and the machine controllers, but not necessarily be forced to adopt the cluster object itself. It's not that it has much meaning without it. It's that I may want to provide my own alternative.
I think this is particularly pronounced because in the machine object space, because you may just want to use machine objects for provisioning things that aren't clusters, or you may have, in our case, you may be adapting the machine pieces and then working on adapting the cluster API as well.
Yeah, and I think to just chime in as well, it's the difference between loosely coupled and tightly coupled.
Yeah, the approach that we took in MetalCube for dealing with machines that are not part of the cluster was to define a new object that represents those. I don't know if anyone else has done that in their approach.
So I'm curious to know more about the use cases on why not use the cluster, given that it doesn't give an opinionated, or in the future, what we're thinking about is it won't give right now, for example, the cluster, as I was mentioning, you have to create things in a certain way, right? Which I believe that's the main limitation. So I'm curious if you see other limitation that you're mentioning here, because one thing that I would like to say is the tightly coupled the components that we have for machines control plane to the cluster, because they are, at the end of the day, they are part of a cluster. But it doesn't matter how you define that cluster, given that if it has a name and it's inside of a namespace with the machines, they're part of the same cluster.
Also, wouldn't it having a loose coupling assist in additional levels of fragmentation, which might not be beneficial to everybody, long term? That's just one of the, I guess, concerns. Because having kind of a limited set of ways of how you accomplish things kind of helps solidify these approaches, right? And so that's just additional question, if I may.
Well, yeah. I mean,
sorry, can I go? Can I make a point?
Yep.
So with this loose coupling, it will also help in adapting the cluster API incrementally. Like if we don't have loose coupling, there are approaches now. There are installers which will need to adapt, rebase, which will need to rebase and change the whole system at the start. So if we have loose coupling, installers or the provisioners can adapt the cluster API incrementally, step by step, like first the machines and then in next phase the control plane or the cluster level. So this will make the path easy if the coupling is loose. Yeah. Thank you.
I have a suggestion, Vince. I agree with the previous discussions about linking the use cases. I think that will help us. I think we need to try to be methodical when we go through this list. And it might help to start by actually identifying what our goals are. I know we have some high-level goals and requirements, but I don't think they necessarily explain how we should proceed here, because we've had this exact discussion regarding the cluster object at least a dozen times over the last 18 months. And part of the reason for this meeting and new structure is to see if we can actually drive some resolution to these issues. From a historical perspective, I can tell you that we've been extremely hesitant to impose any semantics which are not universal across all providers. And we've done that because, A, we're an open source project, and so we intend to be inclusive, but also because we're kind of early in the process and we're not certain that all of the decisions we make are actually the right ones at this point. But long term and going forward, I think it's important that we assume additional semantics. The lack of additional high-level semantics limits what kind of tooling can be built on top of the cluster API. So for instance, if we have no semantics around the control plane because we say there are cases where you cannot manage the control plane, that means that all higher-level tooling cannot manage the control plane because the cluster API provides no semantics, right? I think I would personally like to avoid that going forward. So to recap, the 2 points are, I think we might want to identify our goals, and like one goal I'd suggest is to enable higher level semantics, or to enable semantics for higher level tooling, right? And that can be justified using the requirements or use cases doc. But then also that we go through this and try to be really diligent about not conflating multiple issues, and just look at each type and the problem it attempts to solve to the extent possible without referring to problems that may be solved by other types.
Yeah, and to reiterate, the goal of this meeting is to set those goals and or like possibly in this Google Doc, and then kind of pour them over into which we'll be able to work on asynchronously over the next few weeks.
So I think that was a really good point, and that what that translates to me is understanding the like you mentioned, the use cases, and then the use cases for each individual type, which will dictate the API that type has to expose. And so, you know, and it's those APIs that end up being the contract between the types as well. So I think that understanding the real use cases is probably the only way to get there.
Thank you. I think it's an excellent point, and I really love the approach. Thank you.
Perfect. So for next steps, I think I'll send a new document about with the CAP template, and we'll start like adding use cases. I'll go through the existing use cases doc and kind of try to link them, the one that are already existing. And please do join the SIG group to have edit access, given that I'll give it edit access to the whole SIG, so you'll be able to contribute. Going back to the cluster, John, I'm really curious about the problem that you saw with the current approach in the cluster, and what do you think the cluster will need to do later on?
So I'm in the cluster. The main issues I saw, actually, I don't know who that is, CNCT, but one of the issues, it wasn't so much that there's a big problem with the cluster, is that I'm not sure there's a lot of value in it, in that it doesn't have much semantics associated with it. And so if I don't need to adopt it, then, you know, because I don't see the value in it, then, and you said it's optional, so I may just have to go back and look at what we implemented and see if I understand exactly why I thought there was an interdependency. But I want to make sure that as I adopt individual pieces of the cluster API, that I'm getting value out of it, and that whatever it imposes on me, you know, is worth it. And I think that the machine thing, the value is clear if you're trying to deploy things. If you're trying to deploy things across multiple providers, for example, in on-prem use cases where you may want to support vSphere and you may want to support other infrastructure providers, but the cluster, I guess, because so much is pushed into the provider config, it's a little bit difficult for me to see the value in the cluster object today.
So I would say today the biggest value in the cluster object is, and this is only recently, as of maybe like a month and a half, 2 months ago at the most, when we started adding the remote object references and the owner references, it gave you the ability to kind of handle like cascading deletion of the cluster. Longer term, the real value that I see for the cluster object is really being a single point within cluster API to go to rationalize about the clusters. So ideally, I would love to see certain types of status get bubbled all the way up to the cluster object, so that as an operator if I want to be able to sit there and introspect the health or status of my clusters, I should be able to start with the cluster object to see like kind of an aggregated state of that cluster, so to speak, and then only have to dig into the different components of the cluster if, you know, I have to. But that's kind of where I see kind of like the cluster object being, is like the single point to start being able to reference and rationalize kind of the state and status of my clusters, as well as kind of, if I am managing clusters more immutably, a single place to go and delete kind of those clusters as I need to, so that it's not a matter of trying to track the references to all the different objects to be able to handle that cleanup.
Yeah, and I suppose in any distribution, I guess we all think we all think with the concept of a cluster today. There's a defined meaning of more or less in Kubernetes for that. So there's going to be all those infrastructure resources that were mentioned earlier are often going to be on a per cluster basis. So having some record of there's a cluster and these are the things associated with it makes sense. I guess I'd like to understand more if it's possible to build more semantics and therefore more value into that, or if that's just going to be a non-starter because it puts too much opinion in the spec. And I guess it comes back to those use cases.
If I can comment something, it's like in the Gardener project that we've been working with, they recently came to the same situation. They came to a different concept that they want to mess up, but the conclusion was very similar to what Jason said. They realized that they need an anchor just to have the status and some endpoints to manage the cluster. And actually it was interesting because they have this object that now they are considering using for even clusters that are not directly managing or they are not created using the Gardener project. However, they can monitor them together. You are limited because, for instance, you don't have an endpoint for doing some certain actions, but you can monitor them, but you can get the status. And this is really useful when you have a large infrastructure to, as Jason said, you have all the status there, and you can know which, based on this concept of the endpoints, you can know which action you can actually make in this cluster. For instance, you don't have access to the control plane for whatever reason, you don't have this access point. I'm sorry, it's endpoint. And if you do, you can have the credential for accessing it. So it's quite useful for tooling. Even if it's not extremely rich semantics, for tool building is really useful.
One thing I add about the cluster is it's useful to think about having like an umbrella type, as I mentioned, to also reiterate on the goal that kind of we're setting for Cluster API to manage Kubernetes clusters. Like one thing that I want to try to avoid is having machines so like loose that like in the future we might want to like embrown the scope, and that's okay. But at this point in time, we did decide to manage Kubernetes clusters, and the cluster will kind of tie up all these resources together and provide a better UX, right? That's one thing that we're missing at this point in Cluster API is how do we streamline UX across providers? The idea is that the cluster type could do that, right? In the fullness of time, could offer that streamlined UX for users and also developers, right? Because like when we create a new provider today, the cluster type that we have today is kind of overloaded, has like a lot of meaning to it, and it's really undefined what it should do and what it shouldn't do. And so that's what I would like to see like out of the proposal that this group will put into Cluster API, which is the boundaries between the types, where one ends and the other one starts, and what's the relationship between the types.
So that sounds like you said that we're trying to establish the goals. That sounds like a very clear set of goals. We should have it. Maybe at the top of the agenda, we should put what those goals conclusions are instead of burying it somewhere in the notes. I mean.
Yep. I'll as an action item after this meeting, I will share a document specific to start working on the definition and requirements and goals and use cases for each type that we're trying to bring into Cluster API. How does that sound?
And then we can collaborate on enhancing it. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's great.
Sounds good. Any other question, comments, concerns?
No, I think let's get to it.
All right, sounds good. I think we can give you all 20 minutes back, and I will follow up either today or tomorrow with a new document with the template, the CAP template, and collaborate on it.
Thanks a lot, Vince.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.